Well, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Laura Stewart. I'm the Chief Academic Officer at 95% Group, and I am delighted to welcome you all to today's webinar, Trust in the Science of Reading to Improve Intervention Outcomes. And I'm joined today by two amazing literacy leaders, Sarah Mwangi, Assistant Superintendent of Learning Services from the Joplin Schools, Missouri, and Libby Bird, Coordinator of Elementary Curriculum and Instruction at Joplin Schools. And you'll be hearing from Sarah and Libby a little bit later to tell their amazing story. You know, we at 95% Group have been able to partner with Joplin. And just a couple weeks ago, I had the pleasure of listening to Sarah and Libby tell their story to a group of literacy leaders. And it's such a great story that I'm so delighted they'll be able to share it with you today. So a little bit about 95% Group. We are a leading provider of trusted, proven literacy solutions. Why 95%? Well, we know, and we hold this as our center, that with the high quality, evidence-aligned instruction that we can provide for students, 95% or more of our students can learn to read. And that really is the promise that we make. We are a company that has foundational principles. We believe that all children deserve a chance to learn to read. And I'm sure each of you who are joining us today shares that principle in the work that you do. And by the way, we applaud and support you in the work that you do every day. Our purpose in the organization is to unlock the power of literacy for every child. And we do that by building on the science to empower teachers, actually all educators, with knowledge and resources and support to transform developing readers. So I'm really proud to be part of 95%, and again, delighted to be here with all of you today. So our talk today is really going to be taken a great deal from our latest ebook, which is called The Science of Reading Guide to Intervention. And we're going to drop the link in the chat. You can also get it through the QR code that you see here. And it's really just a terrific guide as how we can improve student literacy outcomes. It also provides an overview of what we offer at 95% Group, and also tells stories of successful outcomes that you can achieve for your students. So please be sure to refer to this guide to intervention as we go through our webinar today. All right. And I also want to mention, I am joined by my colleague, Barbara Patterson, who's kind of behind the scenes for us. Thanks for your support, Barb. All right. So in the Science of Reading Guide to Intervention, you know, I make this statement that the truth is we don't have time to waste. We have to get reading intervention right. And it seems really obvious. But, you know, when we look at the national landscape and we look at our reading proficiency scores, you know, they have been languishing for a long time. And this really helps propel us to think about acting with a sense of urgency. You know, what we're seeing here and what you can see in terms of just, you know, reading achievement, but then kind of this downward trend. And what we're seeing is this continuing decline in reading scores and an increasing gap between the higher performing students and the lower performing students. This is the most recent NAEP 2024. So, and I want to point out, you know, these trends were happening before the pandemic. You know, and that's why there's such an urgency here. We know that students with the lowest levels of literacy face potentially grim life outcomes, higher dropout rates, lowered employment opportunities, a potential for entering or staying in cycles of poverty, which impact health and housing and just overall well-being. And we know that there are high rates of illiteracy and low literacy levels in our juvenile detention facilities or prisons. So this is urgent. And when people say to me, well, Laura, where do we begin? Do we begin with preventative foundational instruction in the early grades or intervention in the upper grades? And it really isn't an either or, it's a yes and. Intervention needs to be effective and efficient. We have no time to waste. So when we think about effective and efficient, I want us to think today deeply about the root causes of reading failure and not just think about treating the symptoms. And this quote is from an author named Dan Heath, who wrote a terrific book. If you're not familiar with it, I highly recommend it. It's called Upstream. And what he says is, you know, it's easy to focus on the symptoms of a problem, but we also need to look deeper to find that root cause. So what I'd like to do today is look upstream at three factors that could be identified as root causes of students failing to thrive in literacy. So when we look upstream, I want to identify these three factors. One, oftentimes, especially with our older students, we see that students are not comprehending well, but the truth is it isn't necessarily a comprehension issue. Sometimes when I work in schools or districts, people will say to me, Laura, our fifth graders are not comprehending text. Do you have a comprehension intervention? But the truth is sometimes we have to dig deeper to see the root cause of those comprehension struggles. Number two, we know that teachers are often unprepared to deliver intervention instruction. And the third kind of some upstream cause we need to examine is that the systems for effective intervention are not in place. And I want to call out today assessments, data analysis, resources, and reporting. And I know that our guests are going to be addressing kind of systems change to help us have better outcomes for our students. Okay, so let's start here. Let's start here with students cannot comprehend, but it isn't necessarily a comprehension issue. So I'd like to share this, and I'm going to have you read it to yourself because there's actually quite a bit of text on the page. So go ahead and read this to yourself. Okay, I'm thinking this probably resonates with many of you as I put this up here. This was a study, by the way, undertaken by RAND, Education and Labor, with support from Advanced Education Research and Development Fund. And it was also co-authored by the Educational Testing Service, or ETS. And I find this a really intriguing concept that I think is worth exploring, this idea of the decoding threshold and where many of our students are falling off the cliff when it comes to progression of their reading capabilities and skills. And Anita Archer, who's one of our favorites, she always says this. She says, there is no comprehension strategy powerful enough to compensate for the fact that you can't read the words. And I want to unpack that just a little bit because we know that the ability to develop the automaticity in word recognition is critical for beginning reading. That automaticity, getting that text off the page. And only through that is brain energy freed up to devote itself to thinking through text or comprehending text. And so the research supporting instruction that emphasizes these foundational skills is abundant and clear, and at this point in time, indisputable. I call this the self-perpetuating cycle of reading difficulties, and I think this helps to illustrate what we mean by the importance of foundational skills and how yes, reading acquisition can be difficult at any stage, but we see this so much. This is kind of a pervasive pattern that we see. And by the way, studies have estimated that 80% or more of our children with poor reading abilities in the early to middle grades struggle with foundational skills, mastery of foundational skills. So this is what we mean by this. If we have a foundational skills deficit, we're going to have difficulty in that phonic decoding. And that is really the gateway to what we call orthographic mapping, or storing the words in that word form region of our brain for that accuracy and that automaticity in retrieval. So if we can't pull words out with accuracy and automaticity, that is going to impede our ability to read fluently. And frankly, if we are not fluent readers, we tend to avoid reading because it's painful and because we're not able to comprehend. And therefore, if we avoid reading, we get less reading practice, which impacts our vocabulary growth. Many of you probably know that vocabulary is mainly acquired in the early years through language, spoken language. But from about third grade up, new vocabulary is acquired in text. The next one is limited academic language and content knowledge. If we don't have the vocabulary growth, that limits our ability to access content knowledge at the higher level. And of course, that is going to impact our decline, our ability to comprehend. And that essentially is demotivating to readers. And this can become a self-perpetuating cycle where that kind of cascade of difficulties that begins with a foundational skills deficit can then create a vicious cycle. Lack of motivation that then impacts a student's ability to work through the intervention necessary to fill those gaps. Okay, I hope that makes sense. So when we think about this foundational skills deficit, let's kind of define what we mean by foundational skills. And I use this, kind of as a visual enactment or a vision of what we mean by foundational skills. So most of us see reading and writing skills as these. You see these inner circles here. But I also want to make sure that we understand that language development is also foundational. All these language development pieces are really contributing to that foundational knowledge that our students need to bring to the table to be readers. Reading is a language-based endeavor. So all of these language capabilities support the development of reading skills, which is why I put this in the outer circle, right? So I'll let you go ahead and look at these: vocabulary, listening, speaking, all these language skills, all these language capabilities are really there to support the development of reading and writing skills. So this is really designed to say, look, foundational skills are comprehensive and integrated. And we think about the goals for both reading and writing, for both comprehension and composition. All of these skills and capabilities must be developed, and they're best developed in an integrated fashion, in an interactive fashion, with purposeful, explicit, systematic, cumulative instruction that is driven by data. Okay, all right, so just drop in the chat. In your experience with students in need of intervention, do you see this? Do you see a strong need for the foundational skills? And if so, tell us a little bit about what foundational skills you see as gap areas for your students. Phonemic awareness, fluency, I'm seeing. Jeanette and Diana, when you mentioned phonemic awareness, really that is language-based because it's all about those discrete sounds of spoken language. Vocabulary, yeah, phonics decoding, right. I see some of you from the upper grades that are agreeing to this. Boy, a lot of people are mentioning phonemic awareness for sure. Yeah, so I want us to think about, thank you for those contributions. So I want us to really continue to think about, how are we, first of all, again, it's not an either or, it's a yes and, how are we building these skills and capabilities, language capabilities and reading and writing skills, while we're also at the beginning stages, but then we're also thinking about how are we filling those gaps in our students who require intervention. Because the truth is there really aren't any shortcuts. However, if we can identify those gaps with targeted diagnostic assessments and targeted intervention, we can ameliorate those gaps pretty quickly. Okay, thank you for your contributions to that. Let's go ahead and talk about the second of our factors here, which is the fact that many of us as teachers are unprepared for intervention, instruction. So I want you to go ahead and read this to yourself as well. This is from that same study that I cited earlier. So go ahead and read this to yourself. So, and I wonder if this resonates with some of you as well. What this recent research found is that 44% teachers are reporting that almost half of their students are really having difficulty reading grade level materials, that complex text. And we see 30 to 40% of incoming college freshmen are actually in need of some sort of remedial reading. And I recently read another survey, and this was of high school teachers and also college professors about just the difficulties many of their students are having in grappling with that complex text and the reading load. So if you're seeing this and you are a content area teacher, you're used to focusing on your content and you're asking yourself, what do I do? What do I do if I have kids who can't access the content? I think that's common, and I want to reassure you that, this is oftentimes just a result of the fact that we have not been availed to this information in our teacher preparation program. So you might be familiar with the National Council on Teacher Quality, and this is an organization that collects data on teachers and instruction. And the president of that organization was quoted here in an EdWeek article, actually. Only about a quarter of the teachers who leave teacher preparation programs across our nation enter classrooms prepared to teach kids to read in the way that is aligned with the science and research on reading. So we know that many of us, again, in our teacher preparation programs, have not been availed to the information that we need to adequately teach those foundational skills from the bottom up, or intervene as well. So, but I always want to say this. I want to say this out loud. There's no shame and there's no blame. We have unfinished work around literacy. We know that. But again, not all of us enter the profession with strong preparation in evidence-aligned principles of teaching and learning. I can just tell personally, and I've been in education for a long time, I came up during the whole language years, and that kind of perpetuated into balanced literacy. And so even though this body of research called the science of reading has been around for a long time, this was not part of my preparation. And I hear that over and over again across the country. So what that means is that professional learning is going to have to take up some of the slack by providing that bridge to practice, like taking that research and unpacking it so that we can make it practical. So I have a book that I'm going to quote here. This book is called The Courage to Lead. And this is a book I wrote to really focus on leadership in literacy. And one of the points that I think is important to make is, as leaders who are leading literacy, high quality professional learning is crucial, all right? Crucial. So when we are thinking about as leaders on how we are building a culture of curiosity and learning, let's think about these principles. First of all, when you're thinking about designing professional learning, making sure the professional learning is building everyone's knowledge in evidence-aligned principles of instruction and structured literacy. And when I say everyone, I mean everyone. That means all the way from our teachers who teach our primary students up through the grades, as well as administration, both at the building and district level. We want to make sure that professional learning is steeped in current research and practice and culturally relevant pedagogy. In this book, The Courage to Lead, a gentleman named Mitchell Brookins, who some of you might know, just wrote a wonderful piece for us in here about what we mean by culturally relevant pedagogy. Also, making sure that we have ongoing training and coaching. The coaching piece, as I'll share with you in a minute, is really critical for transferring research or knowledge to practice. Every teacher is a reading teacher. Again, many of us who in the middle grades or upper grades, we are content experts. And so when we have students that are struggling as readers, we don't know what to do. So professional learning is really designed for everybody. Making sure our professional development is ongoing and long-term, we don't have a one and done, we don't have a quick fix. And we need to have time to really process the knowledge that we're learning through professional learning communities. And finally, this last tip is just for, again, our leaders. How do we study and learn alongside our practitioners so that we can support their understanding of the science of reading and the science of learning? Okay, so professional development outcomes. This is just to reiterate how important coaching is. I'm sure some of you are familiar with the Joyce and Showers research. This was, I'm quoting back in 2002, 2002, but this they have continued to publish on this, and we have seen replication of these findings that, when we sit in a professional learning opportunity and we're just presenting theory, we don't have a lot of transfer to practice. Now, it doesn't mean that's not important. Those minutes of professional learning are important to build our knowledge base. But in terms of transfer to practice, where do you see the impact? It's not through a presenter explaining content, like I'm doing with you today. It's not through demonstration, where I'm modeling instructional practices. It's not through practice. It's primarily through ongoing support and guidance when you're back in the classroom? How do I put this into play? Now, again, I don't want to diminish the importance of building that knowledge, but we have to build knowledge and demonstrate and practice and coach to get the outcomes that you see at the bottom of this chart. All right, very good. So drop in the chat, what are some critical elements of professional learning that you have found to be most impactful for your teaching practice? Go ahead and jot that in the chat. What are some elements that have been impactful for you as a teacher, as a leader? What do you see as impactful? Yeah, Lisa, I will get to that. Let me address that question in just a minute. Yes. Okay, Michelle, keep it bite-sized. Yes, Michelle. We don't want to fire hose people, right? Engagement, collaboration. Yeah, you know, that collaboration piece is really important because we can listen to or read to build knowledge, but if we don't have time to process it, that's really important. Observation and feedback. Thank you, Diana. I see a lot of people mentioning letters. So that kind of long-term deep dive into content that letters provides. Peer instruction. Yep. Follow up sooner rather than later. Thank you for that, Stephanie. That's actually right. Yeah, right. Yes, it's Tara, thank you. Yes, it's continuous. It's not a one and done. All right, very good. Thank you all for these contributions. Wonderful. Coaching, I see, coaching and guidance. That's exactly right. Okay. And I do see some people mentioning the importance of having resources alongside your professional learning. You know, I am a firm believer in that, which is why I'm at 95% group, because I do think it's important that not only are we building our own knowledge, the why, Kara is saying here, the why, it's imperative that we have the why, but we also have to have the how and the what and the tools to enact that in our classrooms. And I know that my friends Sarah and Libby will be talking about that today. All right, awesome. Yeah, reflection, thank you. Oh my goodness, thank you. Great contributions, I really appreciate that. All right, so let's look at our last upstream factor. You know, we've looked at the importance of foundational skills. We looked at the importance of teacher professional learning. This last one is probably the biggest and most important. When we find that the systems are not in place, specifically assessment, data analysis, resources, and reporting, we really cannot truly uphold our goals for both initial instruction and for intervention. So let's dig a little bit more into this. All right, so the simple definition of MTS, when we talk about a system, we talk about the macro system. We're really looking at multi-tiered systems of support. And this is from my friend and colleague, Stephanie Stoller. It's really, it's not complicated. It's complicated to implement, but in terms of understanding it, it really is find out what our students need, provide it in the regular classroom reading instruction, and then intensify support as the data indicates the need, right? And it's a process of really maximizing our students' performance because we're matching instruction efficiently and effectively with student needs. And that requires us to use assessments, data analysis, and what we refer to as the collaborative problem-solving process. So before we get into the collaborative problem-solving process, let's level set on the idea of the tiers of instruction. So this graphic, which I think is, you know, I've developed this graphic to really help understand this. So tier 1 instruction is core. It's grade level instruction for all students, and it's delivered in whole group and small group or small group, right? So it has flexible grouping options, but it's core instruction for everybody. Tier 2 is delivered to a subgroup of tier 1 students, and it's providing them with additive, not replacement instruction, because that will give them the more time, the smaller group size, and the targeted instruction that they need, right? Time, intensity, and focus. And tier 3 instruction is the most focused instruction delivered to the smallest group of students, providing them with the most instructional time, okay? So that's just to kind of level set. I'm sure everybody tuning in today probably knows what we mean by tiers of instruction, but I just wanted to reiterate that. And let's all remember, kids are not tiers, instruction is tiers, right? All right. And I think this graphic, which I'm borrowing from Jan Hasbrook and Deb Glazer, with their permission, is from their excellent book on reading fluency. But I think this really helps to frame what we mean by the tiers within an assessment cycle. So first of all, the instructional cycle begins, again, with delivering that high-quality, evidence-aligned Tier 1 instruction to all of our students in whole group, small group, combination of both, et cetera. All right, from that, we are going to be able to, we need to identify our students who are at risk. Now, because today's topic is intervention, that's what I'm focusing on. I'm talking about students below benchmark. Remember, you can also identify kids who are above benchmark who need enrichment. But today, we're going to talk about students who need intervention. All right, we need to then, from that, we have to determine what are those needs that they have, and we have to plan instruction for tiers 2 and 3. Then we have to implement a plan and monitor it, and then make changes or continue the plan. Now, what the driver is here is really the assessments. So we want to make sure we have a really good universal screener that gives us the data we need to identify those students at risk. And I want to make a point here that if we have an overabundance of children that look like they're below benchmark and in need of intervention, we have a Tier 1 problem, because Tier 1 instruction should meet the needs of 80% or more of our students. And I think our friends are going to talk about that today. Good Tier 1 instruction. You cannot intervene your way out of a reading problem, right? You have to have that good core instruction. All right. But now once we know the kids who are below benchmark, we can't just say, lump them all together and give them intervention. What do they actually need? What does each child need? And that's why your diagnostics come in. And we'll talk about that later as well. And then, of course, you need progress monitoring, because we want to make sure that we progress monitor frequently so that we know that if our instruction's working. Progress monitoring is about our instruction. And if our instruction is doing its job, our kids will move along, keep moving. But if we're not progress monitoring, and if we're not gauging our instruction and changing it as necessary, kids can get caught in what I call the cul-de-sac of intervention, right? And we want to make sure that that doesn't happen. So how do we enact a collaborative problem-solving process? Well, I'm going to posit to you today, there are kind of 4 steps. And this is, we have to define the problem, analyze the problem, develop the plan, evaluate the plan. And this will flesh out a little bit more what we mean by our assessments and the alignment of our assessments. So this is from an article that Stephanie Stoller and I published in Perspectives, fall of 2024. So when we think about database decision-making, how are we collaborating and coming together to define the problem? And the question we're trying to answer initially is, which students need support? That's where the universal screener comes in with all of our students, typically done beginning, middle, end of year. A good universal screener has to be standardized, reliable, and valid. Right? The second thing we have to do is we analyze the problem. The question we're trying to answer is, what should be taught and how? The assessment we use for this, again, is that diagnostic screener for our students below benchmark. We can use that whenever it's indicated that our kids need some additional support. And that should be in depth, and it should be linked to instruction. Our diagnostic tool should allow us to link immediately to what's the gap area and what instructional moves do I need to be able to make? And hopefully, what resources do I have to make those instructional moves? Number 3 is to plan. And that's really when we ask ourselves, is the instruction working? That's what we mean by progress monitoring. That's for our students who are receiving intervention, 1, 2, maybe 3 weeks, but we don't want to stretch that progress monitoring out very far because we want to keep our kids moving forward. That also has to be, brief, standardized, reliable, and sensitive to growth. And finally, we typically, all of us have outcome evaluations that we need to attend to that really is reflective. It's, did our instructional moves work? Did our plan work? And that's for everybody. And that's really that comprehensive assessment. So this is designed just to share with you, what does that collaborative problem-solving process look like? And at what stage of that process are we using the information from these different types of assessments? Also, I want to make the point here that assessment and instruction need to be aligned. When I mentioned earlier that The tiers of instruction should not be replacement. They should be additive. That's a really important point to make. We want our assessment and our instruction to be aligned with the same academic language, the same focus of instruction. Think about, in your own instructional model for intervention, do you have a skills backbone that is consistent across all tiers of intervention? And that same skills backbone is part of tier 1 instruction as well, right? There's a seamlessness of that instruction, that scope and sequence. And the academic language, I want to go back to that because I just kind of glossed over it. But, I always use this example about that was shared with me from a first grade teacher. One of her students was receiving core instruction in her gen ed classroom and then had intervention services provided. And her student said to her, the student was confused. The student didn't understand that what she was teaching in core, long vowel silent E, was the exact same pattern that student was receiving in intervention, but it was called magic E. So how do we align language? How do we give ourselves and our students a common language to talk about instruction? Routines, there are a handful of high quality, replicable, repeatable routines that our kids can learn, and they can use them over and over again, just differentiating the skill area in which we are enacting that routine, with which we're enacting that routine. And that can go across tiers of instruction as well. That really helps our students to know what to do so their energy can be focused on what they're learning. And the same thing is true for us as teachers. If we have a lesson plan that is replicable, repeatable, scalable, if our lesson plans follow an I do, we do, you do approach, if we have, again, a handful of routines that we're using with our students, that allows us to spend more of our cognitive energy on our students and less on figuring out what to do. It's really important that we spend, as educators, our cognitive energy not writing curricula. We want to make sure we've got great tools that allow us to do our jobs. And then finally, obviously, alignment of the data. The data assessment connects to instruction, informs our grouping, and provides visibility to everyone who needs it. Whatever system you're using for data collection, we have to have some mechanism in place so that everyone involved with the education of that child has access to that data. Okay, and again, I'm going to let you read this to yourself. This just reinforces this idea that we have to have coherence and alignment across tiers. Okay, so to summarize, in a collaborative problem-solving model, educators assess with those universal screeners, diagnostic assessments to pinpoint instruction. Assessment also includes that progress monitoring to determine if what we're doing is working. We have to analyze the data to make sure we're getting the right instructional plan for each student, to make sure we're grouping students with similar needs. And then we instruct. We have to teach with precision, utilizing effective evidence-aligned instruction. And then the cycle repeats over and over. All right, and lastly, I just want to make the point again, data visibility. Why do district level administrators and leaders need to know the data for our students? Why do building administrators need to understand? Why do we as teachers need to have visibility into the data? And all invested parties, and why do our students need to know how they're doing? I'm going to give you a minute to go ahead and just look at this chart. And I'm going to be sharing with you later a system that we have at 95% Group that allows that visibility across all of our invested parties. So I'll be talking a little bit more about that later. Okay, so I'm just keeping an eye on time here. I think what I'm going to do is let you think about these two ideas, how important data is to intervention, and what are some non-negotiables when it comes to intervention instruction. And I want to frame the introduction of my colleagues here around the fact that these are some questions that they're going to reflect on and address with you today. So I want to bring in, before I do that, our key takeaways, by the way, from this section. Number one, when we're planning for intervention, we need to look at the root cause. which is often foundational skill deficits. Number 2, effective professional learning in the science of reading is critical to support teachers in providing that intervention. And number 3, takeaway from the section that I just completed, for effective and efficient intervention, we need a cohesive system of assessments, data analysis, resources, and reporting. All right, so without further delay, I want to introduce Sarah Mwangi, who's the Assistant Superintendent of Learning Services in Joplin Schools, Missouri. She focuses on improving student outcomes through research-based literacy practices, and her work emphasizes aligning tiered interventions with core instruction, we just talked about, to support all learners, particularly in addressing challenges like student mobility. And she and Libby will be sharing the demographics of their district, so you'll understand the challenge there. Drawing on her experience as both a teacher and administrator, Sarah is dedicated to creating practical, data-driven strategies that empower educators to build a strong foundation for student success. And I can tell you, I know her well enough to know that that really is the core of her professional work and her personal mission. Libby shares that mission, and they're true colleagues and true leaders in their district. Libby Bird has served as an educator with Joplin Schools for 19 years, holding roles as a classroom teacher, a literacy specialist, instructional coach. And Libby currently serves as the coordinator of elementary curriculum and instruction. Thank you so much for joining us, Sarah and Libby. I can't wait for everyone to hear your story.
Yes, thank you for having us. As we kind of jump in, just to really ground for you that may not be familiar with Southwest Missouri, we want to share just some fast facts about Joplin before we really tell you our story. So you can see here our enrollment trends. We stay pretty steady, 7,400 to 7,600 students across our K-12 campus. We serve a high mobility. These are our 10 elementary schools where we have this system in place, and you can kind of see our state average as well as our district average. We're well above the state average with our mobility. About 1 in 3 of our students move schools every year. And so that plays a big part into our story as we get into it. We serve a relatively high free and reduced lunch population. We sit around 60% or higher. These are our surrounding districts. Joplin is a smaller city, about 50,000, but we sit around a lot of small towns around us. And so we definitely have the higher end of the poverty within our region. And then additionally, we serve a high level of special education students. We've been working intently of decreasing this over time. As you can see, we've done some work with that. So we are making headway, but we still serve a large population, specifically with learning disabilities. So really just to tell you our journey, we want to kind of walk through a timeline. And this actually started pre-COVID, as wild as it seems. We had a couple of teachers, Joplin has been in that history where many of you may feel we've been living in an upside down triangle. We were trying to serve anywhere from 60 to 70% of our students in an intervention. And we were sending our students out to intervention, to our title teachers, and hoping that they would fix them and they would come back. And I often refer it to a hamster wheel. It wasn't for a lack of trying. We had teachers working extremely hard, trying to do a lot of things, but we weren't making headway. Keep in mind our high mobility rate. We were trading kids among our campuses quite often. And while one teacher had good intentions, they would send a student, transfer them to another school, also with good intentions, but the language wasn't similar. Our strategies may not have been similar, and the skill deficit we're addressing may not be similar. The other piece of our story, we fell into the trap of what I called title lifers. Once title, always title. You got there and you stayed. It wasn't a system that you came in and out of that. And so in April of 2019, we had a couple of teachers who attended, it was actually a 95% symposium up in Kansas City. And it really drove us into, we talked a lot about product, and we have made the mistakes of chasing shiny stars. And we realized we had a major lack of teacher knowledge, and we really had to get in and understand the why with what we were trying to do with literacy. So we implemented a 4+ year sustainable plan, 4 letters, district-wide. We had 30 teachers who began volume 1, and our administrators engaging in that work. And we ended up moving it where all 10 elementaries, we developed our own facilitators. Now, this was in the midst of COVID hitting. They went through volume 1, volume 2, the facilitation for volume 1 and volume 2, and they stayed the course. It's quite amazing to reflect and think about that time, but they did a lot of amazing work in a short amount of time. So once you hit the 21-22 school year and they finished up their letters facilitation, they started training their teachers in their buildings. And so these were mostly K2 teachers in volume 1 to get started in the 21-22 school year. And then we kicked off our intervention. And so we started with actually that intervention level within our system. And so our title teachers got on the same page. They were doing the same interventions. And then we started adding in some summer work with our booster bundles that we worked through 95% with. We, for the first time, started seeing our students move in and out of intervention. And we'll show you, Libby will go over our flow chart. You can kind of see what that looks like for us. We continued our work, and quickly we knew you cannot intervene your way out of a tier 1 issue. We had an upside down triangle. And while interventions started to get on the same page across our campuses, what was happening in our tier 1 was not consistent, and it was not aligning to what we were doing in intervention. So in 23 and 24, we added in 95 core phonics for kindergarten, first and second grade. And then we moved into third, fourth, and fifth grade from there. And so we have a system now where we are K5 with K3 being core phonics, 4-5 being the word study, and our interventions directly aligning with that. And as I walk through some of this data to kind of show you where we're at, I share our story to not tell you that we have arrived. We have not arrived. We still have work to do, but to give you some encouragement of how to get your systems aligned, because just like Laura had shared, we have taken a lot of cognitive bandwidth off of our students simply because we have systems that the students understand. We use the same language in tier 1 as we do in intervention, as we do in our special education classrooms. We've had some really intent driving forces that all kids get tier 1. They do not come out, no matter the complications of a master schedule, they do not come out of the tier 1 classroom. All kids have to receive that. Then we can move the intensity based on the MTSS structure of what they need. So I'll let Libby kind of talk through our system and how we've developed that, and then we'll share some data with you.
All right, so as we mentioned before, with as large as our district is with 10 different buildings, we knew that we had a problem with identifying students in similar fashion. So at building A, we may have identified using one tool, where at building B, it was not the same tool. So when our kids were being transient and moving around, we weren't able to communicate and use the same language on where they were at and what interventions they actually needed. So 95% has helped us with that. We have started with the phonemic awareness screener, or the phonemic awareness diagnostic, where we can see now where kids fall and what skills they actually need. So that has helped tremendously with that problem. Same thing goes with our phonics continuum. We now, even though we've dumped before kids into the phonics bucket, we now can see what skills within phonics that students need, and we can give those intensive instruction to them within our intervention processes. The other thing we noticed was that we didn't really have a way of universally screening students to make sure that we, once again, were all on the same page on how we were identifying and filtering our student population down to the most intensive kids that we needed to serve. So this is where we have worked with our 95% coaches and their knowledge, and then our knowledge from letters, to develop our own flow chart system to help us figure out our whole population. How do we universally screen them, which we use dibbles? How do we take that composite, and how do we sift down to the kids that we actually need to know more about, where we give the diagnostic, either the PASI or the PSI, through 95%, to then identify the skills that they need so that we can plug those holes for them to become readers.
And I'll just share on this part, you may notice on second and third grade. So this is a beginning of year. So if you think of kindergarten, and we worked with 95% consultants to kind of identify the hot spots. In kindergarten, we are most concerned with their phonemic awareness, right? That's the hot topic, hot button item. When you look at this filter, that PASI is going to diagnose that phonemic awareness deficit that we need to intervene on, all while core is still happening. In first grade, for beginning of year, you will notice that we have split the kids out into PASI or PSI. You are only going to see this in first grade at the beginning of the year because we know we still have some kids who need to shore up some phonemic awareness skills. Once you get to second and third for the fall, I want you to notice there's no PASI kickoff, and that is intentional in nature. And what you can't read, probably the writing is too small, we front load. So if we have phonemic awareness deficits in kids, we don't ignore them, but we also have to get them moving on their phonics deficits. And so what we do is we front load the PA and we get them into their phonics skill for intervention. And keep in mind, core is still happening, and there's a lot of PA embedded into good tier 1 instruction as well. So I just wanted to highlight that for you. What has the data told us? When we look at kindergarten, this is also good information for you to know. 1 and 2 of our kids come with no early learning. They don't come with daycare. They don't come with preschool. They're literally coming from home to us. So we have a wide range of skill set when we're starting school. 1 in 4 kindergarten students successfully have been benchmarking on phonemic awareness at the beginning. And by the end of the year, we are hitting about 80% of those students. So we have seen phenomenal growth in our kindergarten students with those phonemic awareness skills. We have noticed we had some blending issues with our kiddos. So we have added back into our tier 1 curriculum some explicit blending activities to help move them along the continuum. In first grade, we have about 35% of them coming in proficient in phonics, and we are ending the year about 65%. So as you can see, it's not where we want to be. We still have work to do in this area, but we've identified the need to increase some fluency as a priority, drawing attention to letter sound automaticity. And sometimes we can forget that once they get past that kindergarten age. And then when we hit second grade, I call it the great divide. This is where we're really starting to see in our data the haves and the have-nots. The kids split into 2 groups. You have students who are benchmarking and they're just fine and they're moving along. And then you have this population who are stuck, where we're front-loading PA and we have them in intensive phonics intervention. And so with that, one of the things that we know moving forward, and Laura says this frequently in her talks, we need more reading mileage. Our kids need more practice. When you go back to that cycle that she had shared at the beginning and you go down that continuum, we have to get some more reading mileage out of our kids and some practice. Then as you enter our 3rd through 5th grade, we get into now the upper grade teachers are starting to realize they need some of the why. They're building that multi-syllabic words and routines, and they're into core. We're starting to see a shift with our moving from learning to read to reading to learn, and that's starting to shift in our data. So it's pretty exciting what we have coming through our system. This is my favorite slide. I wish you were in person because I hope it makes you giggle, maybe not giggle in a good way. But since we're not, this is, look at the dates down here. This is October of 19 all the way to March of 20, right? Before we all went home. And this was our first round of intervention when we started interventions in our system with 95%. And you can notice that these kids are skyrocketing in many times. So we call this, I had a literacy mentor, Judy, who once told me, Sarah, this looks like the classic ABT, ain't been taught. And that is really true for what we saw in a lot of things. It wasn't that our kids who were transient, poverty, special needs, it wasn't that they couldn't, it's that they didn't have the opportunity based on what we did or did not do with explicit instruction. And so we saw that right off the bat, kids just skyrocketing with their data. which was really encouraging and motivating to our teachers. And then as we get into our 95 Phonics Core program, we really created situations where the data speaks for itself. What I would encourage you is listen to your teams. We really had a system, from my perspective, helping lead this work at the district level. Our teachers, once they got the efficacy of the knowledge, they know what we needed to do. And so it was really empowering them to move along that. We started a slow rollout with kindergarten, with core, added in first and second because they started begging for it. We've had some movement in our state with some resources, so we were able to add 3 through 5 on in 1 year. But we've had some more hesitation in our upper grades, especially 4, 5, and you probably can imagine reasons why. They're not used to foundational skills. And so they're in that a little bit of uncomfortable state, and we continue working with them. And then the final thing I'll just say, speaking from my own experience, I have a daughter who's a good reader. She reads pretty well. And so sometimes you can get in those habits where kids think, oh, I don't need this, or teachers think, oh, I don't need this, as you get into that 3rd, 4th, 5th grade. But what we are noticing, and just from her example, she's telling me about morphology as a 9-year-old. Well, I can promise you that before we did not explicitly teach really good morphology. So when you take that skill that we're developing, even in 3rd, 4th, and 5th, take that into middle school, high school, college, career, they're really developing good morphology, a stronger vocabulary, as well as how they're tackling multisyllabic words when you're getting into science, high math terminology. So even if you're in a system where maybe you have a lot of good readers, there is still a piece that I would encourage you to dig into when you're looking at those word study components with your upper elementary. And then last but not least, this is just one success story of 10 campuses, just to give you some real data. In 2021, 22, that whole time frame, we had a school where 183 students out of that K-5 school were qualifying for intensive services. And then where they sit today, they are down to 20% of that population receiving support. And what that's allowed, our staffing hasn't changed, but now our title teachers can also become instructional leaders for their teachers in that tier 1 setting as well. So the shift is happening. We are not arrived, but we are well underway. And it's just encouraging to see really an at-risk population we serve with the ability to move forward and become readers, which will help them for their whole career.
That is fantastic. Thank you so much, Sarah and Libby, for sharing your story. And I just have to say, the data tells the story so well. And I just so appreciate the work that you continue to do, the relentless work that you continue to do. As I was listening to you, I thought I kind of had like some major ahas. When you started out by saying it wasn't for lack of trying, and that's so true. There's no shame, there's no blame. We're all trying really hard, but you recognize really well, I think, that then you have to start with the importance of why. You have to lay that foundation of why for teacher professional. That's where teacher professional learning comes in. The other point that I think that was so beautiful is that it's all about coherence and alignment and consistency across tiers of instruction, across your materials that you use. You're using 95% group, our core and our intervention, and they're completely aligned. But then also coherence and consistency across the whole district, especially in a high mobility population, when kids are moving around, so they can seamlessly move into their instruction, knowing what to expect. The third thing, the importance of the diagnostics. We just can't overestimate that. And the fourth thing you said, ongoing journey. Thank you for that. This is an ongoing journey, and striving to always do right by our students and to do the best possible, make the best possible moves that we can make for our students. And again, I just so applaud and appreciate you in your tireless efforts on behalf of your students. So I just wanted to, reiterate, because 95% Group publishes just terrific aligned literacy resources. I wanted to make sure to say, that those resources must support our educators, our teachers, in actualizing what we know from the evidence, right? So we want evidence-aligned instruction. We have, 95% group has a wonderful literacy intervention system, which creates that ecosystem of assessments and instruction. Our literacy intervention system, it can diagnose at the phoneme awareness level and the phonics skill levels, those gaps at a very granular level, and organizes that data to help automate and manage the grouping. That's huge. And it'll help us with progress monitoring and offers all that visibility to all the stakeholders that we talked about earlier. So it really is a system that supports MTSS frameworks, and it also includes professional learning. So that's what we're really looking for, is that alignment, consistency, and coherence within an assessment intervention system that allows the collaborative problem-solving process to unfold. And Phonics Lesson Library, which is what they're using in Joplin, it's that tier 2 intervention. It aligns with that screener, with that diagnostic, and it provides really specific lessons that are aligned in lesson planning. They're aligned in the routines that the kids are using. And it really allows us to teach skills to mastery using structured literacy, application of skills within reading and writing, and this whole digital format to really deliver instruction efficiently. So just a little alignment there that I wanted to make sure you knew. So when we think about, our phonics lesson library, our intervention, we can assess them with our literacy intervention system that'll help us group our students and point to the actual lessons that kids need to be engaged in to fill those gaps. And what's possible with all of this, with all this aligned, coherent, high quality, evidence aligned instruction? Well, we know with all of that delivered by a skilled teacher, the percentage of first graders below that 30th percentile can be reduced to 4 to 6%, which is where our name comes from. 95% or more of our students can learn to read. All right, very good. Thank you so much for joining us today. Again, key takeaways. You need to look at that root cause, look upstream, and know that professional learning is a huge part of this to help us provide effective instruction. And thirdly, look at the whole system. You have to have a system that is aligned in assessment, data analysis, resources, and reporting. Because the truth is we don't have time to waste. We have to get this right. Here's our contact information should you want to reach out to any of us to hear more about our stories. I did want to mention, there was one question I know for sure, and it was a question about resources for multilingual students. What happens when we have to follow scripted lessons, vocabulary questions, and there's no flexibility? I wanted to address that question because I think a lot of us with our second language, our English learners, have the same questions. So, we have, luckily in-house, we have an expert in this field. His name is Dr. Antonio Fierro, and he's able to provide for us a lot of guidance in terms of how do you scaffold even a lesson that's designed for native English speakers. How do you scaffold and support your multilingual learners within that lesson? And if you check out our website, we have a drop-down box under professional learning called Insights, and he's written about that very topic. How do you make adjustments in scaffolding even within a very explicit lesson plan? The other thing I do want to say, though, is I'm a big fan of lessons that have consistent and explicit instructional dialogue because it helps us as teachers maintain that focus on the lesson plan and also gives us the freedom to internalize that language so that we can then focus on the students. So that scripted instructional dialogue, I think, is really important, especially at the beginning when we're starting to use a resource. But nonetheless, please look up on our website, and I don't know if Barb is able to drop that in the chat, but we have a lot of insights from Dr. Fierro on that very topic. And it looks like she just did that. All right, very good. Thanks, Barbara. She's always on the ball. All right, I thank you all for joining us this afternoon. It really has been a pleasure. Sarah, Libby, once again, thank you so much for sharing your story. I know it was really inspiring and informative for our listeners today. So that's it, everybody. Thanks again, and hope to see you next time.